So it's my pleasure to introduce Pat Rowland, who perhaps needs little introduction. Pat has been a member of the Society since its inception. By occupation, Pat was a chartered surveyor and worked at the local valuation office, working for the valuer in the whole of Cumbria. Like a lot of us, Pat was interested in history at O level and A level, but she took a professional training at university and developed her keen interest in history in more recent years. She has recently taken a course at Lancaster University, which has awarded her a Master of Arts in History. So we're speaking to somebody who knows what they're talking about. And it's my great pleasure to welcome Pat to talk to us tonight about the development of tourism in Grange. So over to you, Pat, once we've done the necessary muting, etc. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Stuart. Thank you, Claire. I'm going to talk about the way Grange has developed from about 1800 and the influence that tourism has had on the place. I'll start by defining tourism. The United Nations World Tourism Organization says that tourism entails the movement of people to countries or places outside their usual environment for personal or other purposes. These people are called visitors. Generally speaking, a visitor is classified as a same-day visitor if their trip does not include an overnight stay, and a tourist if it does include an overnight stay. So basically, I'm going to explore the history of visiting Grange since the early 19th century. This is a map of what Grange looked like at around about 1800. It's from the enclosure map. The yellow lines are the roads that existed at that time. There were very few houses. There were 2 inns, though, and the blue line is the coastline. And hopefully you can see that several of the properties are very, very close onto that shore. So the commercial hotel, commercial inn, or as we now know it, the Commodore, it's been variously known as the Guide over Sands, the Bay Horse, the Commercial, say now the Commodore, and it did have another name at some point. That was built in 1730, and the Crown was added in 1789. So I'll just pose a question. Why were the 2 inns in such a small village that was not on a route to anywhere? But before I answer that question, we'll look at Grange in a bit more detail. So this map is about the same date, but it's showing the common land at the time. The white areas are common land, and the coloured in browny areas are it's land that's owned by people. So Grange is quite restricted. It can't. The hillside is common land, and obviously all around it is. It can't be developed. Nothing can be built on it, and this all changed when the Enclosure Act of 1796 became law, and the common land was allocated to people who had common rights. The surplus land was sold by the people, by the commissioners, and people with smaller plots sold to the adjoining landowners. And several wealthy gentlemen built second homes, and they were able to acquire land cheaply in the area to enlarge their estates. One of these people was John Wilkinson, ironmaster. He built Castle Head at Lindale in 1780, and he died and was buried there in 1808. This particular picture is drawn by Gilbert Gilpin, who was one of Wilkinson's agents. So if we start at Lindale as part of the bay, from Wilkinson's land, the next major owner round was Thomas Holmes Maud of Kendal. He owned Blythe Cottage and the adjoining land, which was described as his country residence. And that was built about 1800, about the time of the enclosure. He was mayor of Kendal in 1799 and 1813, and he lived in Kendal. His father had established Maud Wilson and Crewdson Bank, one of the two banks established in 1788 in Kendal. And he retired eventually to Blyth in 1836. His house was located on the site that now we know as the Netherwood Hotel. And that became a hotel only in the 1930s. The next major landowner around was just past Windermere Road. Maud's land was one side of Windermere Road, and on the other side of that road was the Wakefield family land. The Wakefields of Kendal and Sedgwick had purchased land at Woodland at Eggerslack from the commissioners. But at that point, they'd wanted the land for the wood on it. They wanted to make charcoal for the gunpowder works, and they didn't actually build a second home until the 1860s. Next one around in the Yewbarrow estate is Benjamin Hall, a Quaker and a wealthy London stockbroker. He owned the Yewbarrow estate, having inherited it from his grandfather and father, who had lived at High Newton. He built Yewbarrow Lodge in 1832, but he didn't actually move into it until 1840. He was still living in London until 1840. And he exploited the growing popularity of Grange as a gentle convalescent and retirement resort. And he added to his landholding, buying the land up the hill, and he built several larger houses for people to hire on an annual basis or a monthly basis, and invalids would come and stay in the area. And he lived in various ones and let others out throughout his time in Grange. And one other big landowner was John Fitchett of Warrington. He was solicitor of the Wilkinson estate, and he bought Home Island, and he built his house there in 1832. The Kendal architect George Webster built a second home on the seashore between 1837 and 1841, though he lived at Elahow at Lindale. And the house that he had on the seashore was called Black Rock, and it had a sea water bath. And he wasn't very happy when the railway proposals came along, because they would have blocked, well, they did block his access to the shore, and he was one of the major objectors to the railway. And though not in Grange, Holker Hall was both a place where friends of the family came to stay, and from before the railway opened, visitors staying in Grange and the district were allowed to go to Holker Hall. They could explore the gardens, and they were invited in to see the art collection. So, you know, there were plenty of things to do. Right, so Humphrey Head Spring. Sick people came to stay in the area to drink water from here. They came to the area because the climate was mild, the air was unpolluted, the water from the spring was very clean, and it was thought to cure breathing problems. Another reason to come to the area was bathing in sea or salt water. It was very fashionable, and very rich people could travel abroad to visit special baths. There were various spa towns in Britain, including the one at Buxton that was developed in the 1780s by the fifth Duke of Devonshire, the uncle to the Cavendish at the Holker estate. And at some point in the 1780s, somebody decided it was a good opportunity to start pushing Grange as a sea bathing place. And I think that is probably why the Crown Hotel was built in 1789. There were problems around that time. People couldn't travel abroad because of unrest, Napoleonic Wars and such like. There was a lot of pressure on the English spa towns. And an advert in 1819 stated that the Crown is built for the accommodation of ladies and gentlemen in the bathing season. It's delightfully situated on a prominent eminence and commands extensive views of Morecambe Bay and the distant hills. In 1824, when it was advertised again, it again referred to it being a fashionable bathing place. And it had a hot bath on the premises, which will be conveyed into the house. Is that a tin bath? But anyway, it suggests that Grange was being emphasised as for ladies and gentlemen, and the miners who came to Humphrey Head, they would stay in Fluteborough and Alathwaite. They wouldn't go to Grange probably. So how did the visitors get here? Oh, sorry, that's a picture of the Crown that was built in 1789. This is probably about 1840, but very different looking building to what is there now, but we'll come back to that. So people came on the public carriage across the sands. This is an 1820 sketch by an unknown artist, and it shows the public carriage. Today we would go by car, plane, train, ferry, ships, but most of those types of transport didn't exist 200 years ago. Roads were rough and dangerous, but you could ride a horse over them, but I think most ladies and gentlemen wouldn't have come by horse. And the main route to the peninsula was across Morecambe Bay, and most people would have travelled in the coach drawn by the horses, or you could walk across the sands. It was a dangerous journey and only took place when the tide was out, and a specially appointed guide would lead the people wanting to cross. I guess people would have arrived in boats, but I haven't found any evidence or descriptions of such a journey. This is a picture by David Cox, dated 1835, showing the type of procession that would have been taken by the guide across the sand. People on horses, people walking, people in the public carriage. There's a cart and horse towards the front. And this is another, well, this is the typical cart and horse. And this is the 1843 painting or drawing by Charles Joplin called Sands Road. Whether that's a cockling cart or just another carrier in the distance is not quite clear enough. And finally, J.M.W. Turner, this beautiful picture of Lancaster Sands in 1825. Again, that looks like it might be the public coach going across. So I'm going to read now a description of a holiday in Grange that was written about 200 years ago and describes the journey over the sands. It was published in 1850 in Sketches of Grange. And the lady came to spend a holiday in Grange. We took the Oversands coach from a little inn at Lancaster. We drove 3 miles before reaching the crossing point, being from Hessbank to Kentsbank. The large coach swayed from side to side and the horses plunged through deep channels. The guide met us, a strange, wild-looking figure with masses of long, unkempt hair, as rough as the sheepskin thrown across the old white horse. He saw us over the dangerous parts, looking for quicksand. When we were safe, he thrust his sheepskin cap at us and asked for a tip. The writer commented on the beautiful glimpse of glimmering gold sand all around, and as far as the eye could see, fells and woods and hills. Ahead lay the lovely little village of Grange, consisting of a few white cottages. At Kentsbank, the writer left the coach and was met by Mr. Turner, who took her to Grange on his horse-drawn cart. She stayed in his pretty little cottage and got milk and butter from the big farm close by. She remarked that the sea lapped alongside the road, only separated from it by a low wall where you could sit if walking. The coastline was described as having rocks and inlets where in primitive days we could bathe in pure seawater. When the tide rushed in, it sometimes flooded some of the cottage closest to the shore. The nearest butcher was in Cartmel, but a local lady would get the provisions from Kendal in her horse and cart. We ate cockles from the bay and bowls of wild strawberries and raspberries picked in the local woods. Another local fisherman and her brother caught salmon, which was purchased at a much smaller amount than we would have had to have paid in Manchester. Local bread was not baked in an oven, but in a kind of pan covered over with peat. Fuel was peat and wood, unless a coal boat had floated up on the tide. There was no electricity or gas for lighting or heating. Water was from wells, which were fed us by springs, as there was no water supply. The postman walked over the fell from Lindale and brought letters with news from the outside world. So a very, very different visitor experience than today. When the turnpike road between Leven and Newby Bridge opened in 1820, coaches could come to Lindale, where the visitor would have to hire a private carriage to take them to Grange, just like they did from Kentsbank. The route was from the top of Lindale Hill down what we now know as Windermere Road. There was no road between Grange and Lindale from the bottom of Lindale Hill until about 50 years later. The visitor who wrote about the journey across the sands had enjoyed her holiday in Grange and decided to return the following year. But this time she sent for a man from Lindale who had a yellow chaise, a type of light carriage, and a pair of good horses. And so they travelled over the sands privately rather than in the public carriage. She came several times and eventually decided to live permanently in Grange. She said that she'd had many frightening crossings of the sands. Sometimes it was heavy rain, which made it difficult to see, or it was misty. Once the horse plunged into a deep channel and water washed around her feet, so she had to lift them onto the opposite seat. So you can see it wasn't particularly easy to get to Grange, but it was such a lovely destination that people did put up with the problems. This is an example of the monthly timetable for the coaches. This is September 1848. And no, sorry, you can't read it very well. It gives a different starting time every day, obviously, because of the tides. You know, it was a timetable which they kept to. This is a very early sketch of Grange from Blythe Rocks. You can see there are only a few houses. In 1808, it said there were only 19 houses, but 2 inns. And in 1806, an advert in the paper said a newly built and convenient house was offered to let or as a temporary residence, commanding extensive views over the estuary, and it was highly eligible for an excellent bathing place. So bathing was a major attraction at Grange. So this next one is about 1840, from a very similar position, but considerably more houses now. It's about 10 years before the railway arrived. You can see Captain Wright's house, you can see the Commodore, and you can see the tower in the middle that was was Webster's house. But in 1857, the railway arrived. The steam trains were seen passing through, but we didn't have this beautiful railway station at that time, because originally the railway was built to transport iron ore from Barrow. But very soon after it opened, passenger services started to run. And the station didn't actually get built until 1872. It was a small hut until then. Postcards to show the family had arrived safely at Grange over Sands. Aren't they elegantly dressed? And they don't have a lot of suitcases with them, but they obviously are going to stay. They've come for their holiday. It suggested there were two types of visitors to Grange: those who came for quiet pleasure, fresh air and walking, and secondly, the invalid. This view of Grange is probably about 1870, mid-1870s, because it shows the station, it shows Grange Hotel, and if you look very carefully, there's a small train puffing towards the station. In the distance is Home Island, which eventually got attached. Well, the access to it, a causeway was built. This picture is finishing off the entrance to Grange Hotel. The hotel was built in 1866 by the railway company to encourage more visitors to travel by train and come to stay at Grange. On the right-hand side, you can see the stable block. The horses were used to pull the carriages, which offered trips to enable people to explore the area. We were only 6 miles from Windermere. They would take them to Windermere for a ride on a boat on the lake. But the hotel itself had beautiful views from, it was built up on a rise. It had views over the bay. And an 1868 advert had the heading "Winter Residence." The hotel stated it had admirably adapted as a winter residence or for invalids, the climate being similar to that of Devonshire. In 1868, another news item described Grange over Sands as a district comparatively new to excursionists. Well, they'd been coming for at least the previous 70 years. And it was reported that the Turkish baths had been completed at the Grange Hotel in 1868, and bathing huts were available, but we've never seen any pictures of those, sadly. The ornamental gardens in front of the hotel originally were a very marshy area, and it was decided that as the hotel would be overlooking it, they would create this beautiful ornamental garden and pond. And it was completed just before the hotel was finished. There's actually some children sat right on the edge of it, if you can see them at the bottom left-hand corner. So the hotel had these lovely views over the duck pond to the bay. Grange didn't get its over sands suffix until the late 1860s. It's been suggested that Reverend H.R. Smith, who was the second vicar of Grange, when he arrived in 1858, he got rather fed up with his post going to Grange in Borrowdale, and he suggested that it should be called Grange over Sands. But I can't find any evidence of it being used until the railway timetable adopted it in May 1869. It looks like it might have been a clever marketing phrase thought up by the railway company, but no, it was in use before that. Before we got the hyphenated form, the newspapers referred to the village as Grange, comma, and then one word, over Sands. So I quite prefer, I think, the hyphenated version. So this picture shows how the ornamental pond developed, and obviously this is in the 20th century. The war memorial is there, but everything's sort of grown up very very profusely. One of the unusual things is that local newspapers printed lists of visitors each week during the season, a tradition that I've found in other areas since at least the beginning of the 19th century. And I've no idea why they did it. Could it be to attract and impress visitors with the type of people staying? Was it an advertisement for all the different types of accommodation in the area? But it kept somebody busy. And if you ever get a chance to look through them, they're mainly people from the northwest, but there are people from a little bit further afield and more local people. Towards the bottom, there's Tea Bay, and I can see Manchester, Burnley, Thornton in Craven, Kedleston, Wetherby, Whitehaven, Blackburn. So all over the place. The Grange is growing. You can see on this picture there are houses appearing up on the hillside. They're stretching along the edge of the bay. I can't quite date this one, but possibly 1880s, 1890s. The station is there. The church was built in 1853. Ladies are shown in the boat at the front of the sketch. Perhaps they've been out for a sail around the bay. There's a cockling cart in the distance. The other boat that's coming in, have they been fishing? I don't know. But in 1873, it was reported in the British Medical Journal that Grange was in danger of entirely losing its prestige as a resort for invalids for want of proper sanitary regulations. The locals did not want sanitary improvements in the village. The report pointed out that visitors would be advised to go elsewhere and said that other places were advertising themselves as resorts for health. Subsequently, approval was given for a new drainage and water supply. Until the late 19th century, going away on holiday was only for the wealthy. In the early 19th century, everyone had Sunday off. But it was only in the 1870s that some skilled workers began to have Saturday afternoon off. And the 1871 Bank Holiday Act gave workers a few paid holidays each year. At the same time, some clerks and skilled workers began to have a week's paid annual holiday. And they often went to stay at the seaside. And as a result, seaside towns boomed. The first pleasure pier was built in Brighton in 1823, and soon every seaside resort across Britain had to have a pier. Promenades were built, and by the late 19th century, the seaside holiday comprised seaside rock, piers, donkey rides and Punch and Judy shows. Proposals to introduce these attractions didn't meet with approval by the residents of Grange. The town attracted wealthy industrialists and rich men and their families. They didn't want the workers invading their peaceful haven. However, pier was built. This pier at Bailey Lane, you see the Crown Hotel at the top and the church, was built in 1875, and the Morecambe Steamer Company started day trips to Grange, bringing some of those workers across. Visitors could also get on a boat and go for a sail around the bay. The first time it was suggested that Grange should have a pier was in 1866, and the railway company should build it. Another view of Grange from Blythe Rocks, but this time a photograph rather than a sketch. Very, very much developed now. People paddling in the sea, not dressed as we would be when we go in the sea today. But Grange didn't have many organised activities. People came to enjoy walking, the fresh air, and see beautiful views. They'd go on to Humphrey Head, they'd go to Ewbarrow, they'd go to Hampsfell Hospice, various places around. So this is what Grange looked like in 1890. I've only been able to get the Bailey Lane Pier on this. Clare House Pier is just a bit further down. We'll come to Clare House Pier in a few minutes, but a lot more roads, a lot more development. Grange spread out from the centre along the coast, and then it started to expand up the hillside. You needed somewhere for people to live that were looking after the houses, and there were many guest houses. It became acceptable for ladies to run guest houses and the occasional shop. The embankment also, the railway embankment had protected the houses at the front from the high tides and storms. The blue line again shows where the coast was, and the railway is actually just behind it. So as I was saying, places to visit, Hampsfell Hospice, for example, favourite walking destination. Everyone looks very smart, men in their suits with their hats, their ties, women in their long dresses, flowing dresses. Can't have been easy to have walked up to the hospice in those dresses, I don't think. Grange didn't have a golf course until 1894. This is the original golf course on the fell, but not the one that we now know. This was on the other side of the road. It was on the Walkbarrow Lane side of the road. And it existed from 1894 to 1946. After it closed, there was obviously a desire to have a fell course. And so the existing Grange Fell Golf Course was established in 1950, just 4 years after. And at first it was called the Grange New Golf Club. Hazelwood Hydropathic Establishment, or the Grand Hotel. This opened in 1887, and it was much larger than the Grange Hotel, because there was demand for more rooms, more people were coming to Grange. During the early part of the 20th century, the management established a golf course in connection with with this hotel on the land down on the marsh down at Meathop. And the hotel changed its name to the Golf Hotel. And an intriguing advert in a 1920s paper says, aeroplane service between St Anne's and Grange over Sands, landing at Hazelwood Hydro. So the company owned a hotel at Lytham and, St Anne's and at Grange, and they would fly you between the two on your holiday. The service appears only to have operated for a short time. This is the second pier, Clare House Pier, opposite Berners Close, and it's always been said that a second-hand pier from Barrow was moved to Grange in 1893. I've not been able to find confirmation for that, because this pier was built by the Grange Pier and Bath Company and was opened in July 1885 by Sir James Ramsden, who sailed from Barrow to open it. He commented that what Grange needed most was an establishment of communications for cheap trippers. And he thought that the opening of the pier was the commencement of a new era for Grange, which wanted more improvements in that direction. He thought that the shore was rough and rugged for promenading, so next a promenade should be built. The longer and larger pier was built into the channel to allow steamers and yachts to continue bringing day visitors to Grange. The Bailey Lane Pier was still in use at the same time in 1886. Both piers were still in use, but the channel kept moving and the bigger boats were struggling to get to Grange. In 1899, Grange was still being advertised as a picturesque watering place. Because of the mild climate, it was suitable for late summer visits. The usual activities such as boating and walking were available, and fishing was also a sport mentioned. Visiting Humphrey Head with a picnic was recommended, as well as a visit to Cartmel, which was like a cathedral town in miniature. Victoria Hall was opened in 1901, and it was a place for people to go for concerts and watch musical and theatrical shows. Films were shown there before the cinema was developed, and the cinema didn't open until 1922, and that was higher up the hill. We'll have a few pictures now of some of the boats that came to Grange. This is one of the steamboats, the Sunbeam. It said in one of the newspaper articles in 1900, the channel returned to the Grange shore, having been on the other side of the bay for several years, and had therefore prevented steamers from anchoring at Grange. But the pier had become unusable, and in 1903, the ruinous state of the pier was commented on, and it was pointed out nothing could give the visitors a more distinct impression of dismal decay. Where have we heard that before in that location? Early in 1905, the company sold the pier to the Grange Urban District Council for £75. In February 1906, the fate of the dilapidated pier was still uncertain. Then the channel returned to Grange in 1908 again. So it had obviously moved between 1900 and 1908. And the council decided to reinstate the pier. But steamer service was only able to offer excursions until 1910. But the pier continued in use, used by lots of other boats, but not by the big steamers. I thought I'd read you a report of the holiday season in 1915. Though we were fighting the war in Europe, it was reported that a good class of visitors was put up in Grange this Easter, but the place hardly seems to be as busy as in some previous years. Nearly all the chief boarding places, however, have booked up well before Easter. And on Thursday, quite as many trains arrived as usual, notwithstanding the lack of cheap bookings. Hazelwood Hydro has over 100 visitors, and the Grange, Commercial and Crown hotels all did well, and Berners Close had as many as usual. On Easter Monday, a large number of motor-driven vehicles of all descriptions passed through and raised such clouds of dust that on Tuesday morning, the water cart turned out to help dampen the dust. The golf course was well patronised by visitors on Bank Holiday, and there was a considerable amount of driving and rambling done. The promenade presented a busy appearance in the afternoon. The tide was full at about 3 o'clock, and as a consequence, the boats and yachts were very busy. So that was Easter. And then in August 1915, there was a great many visitors were staying in Grange, probably more than ever before. The drivers have all been extremely busy and have had the heaviest loads they could carry, and the boatmen on the front had every boat out on Tuesday afternoon. 8 sailing vessels brought a large number of passengers from Morecambe, though there was not much breeze to push them along. There was a great deal of mixed bathing at the weekend, and the recreation grounds were busier than ever. 22 sailing boats from Morecambe made the trip to Grange on Wednesday afternoon, and this is supposed to be a record number, not only for this season, but as far back as boatmen can remember. As the water did not reach the pier, the passengers, who numbered several hundred, were landed in diverse ways, some taking to small boats, some wading, and others waiting until the tide reached the rocks at the end of the promenade. So yachting, small boats, very, very popular in the early part of the 20th century. But sadly, the pier was destroyed in a storm at the end of October 1928. And that was the end of boating at Grange. The cafe and the bandstand on the prom is quite a well-known view, though the bandstand has now changed. I'm going to talk a bit about that now. The promenade was built over the new town sewer and gave people a new place to walk. It was completed in 1903. If you remember, Sir James Ramsden in 1885 said that a promenade was needed. Well, it took until 1903. The cafe was opened in 1901. It was very close to Clare House Pier. And the bandstand was built so that people could listen to live music. The Urban District Council, Grange Urban District Council, had agreed to purchase the foreshore from the Duchy of Lancaster in 1901 for £650 so that the promenade could be extended. There had been a short promenade from the station towards the far end of the promenade. But the new part that was opened joined up it came from the station to this end of Grange. This view of the Crown Hotel is obviously after 1912 when the clock tower was built. The Crown Hotel had been rebuilt after a fire destroyed it in 1908. A much grander building was put on this very prominent location. The clock tower was a gift from Mrs. Dearden, who also purchased Yew Barrow Woods and gave them to the council for the residents and the visitors to have different places to walk. The bandstand that had been next to the cafe on the prom had to be moved because ladies complained that cinders blowing off the passing steam trains were harming their clothes. So in 1929, Park Road Gardens were opened specifically for relocating the bandstand. And the last of the facilities that came to Grange was the swimming baths. Costing £17,000, they were opened in 1932 and became a very, very popular attraction. In 1826, more than 100 years earlier, a newspaper report of a young man drowning at Grange stated, "The various lives sacrificed in this way annually are now becoming alarming, and all the cautions held out, as it were, unnoticed." In the 1880s, it had been hoped that the newly formed Grange Pier and Bath Company would build a pool close to the pier, but it was another 46 years before we finally got the swimming pool that unfortunately didn't last beyond 1993. Cars began to dominate travel and caravans introduced as a cheaper way to holiday in the area from the 1930s. The industry expanded considerably during the 1950s, and when the Lake District National Park was established in 1951, Grange was one of, the Peninsula was one of the areas where caravanning was encouraged. It was seen as a place that the establishment of large caravan sites could be easily placed. Finally, Cross Bay Walk, led by the guide over the sands, who no longer has people to bring across the sands, just brings guided walks across now. They were only introduced 50 years ago by Cedric, and again, it brings a huge number of visitors to the area. There are and were other things that went on that I haven't touched upon, like Cross Bay Swim and such like, that brought visitors. But as you can see, visiting Grange has been going on for 200 years at least. And it's amazing, isn't it, that we still delight in many of the activities that delighted the early visitors. Walking, fresh air, having picnics, and just enjoying the wonderful views. And thank you all very much. And if there are any questions, I'll see if I can answer them.
Pat, one thing can you hear me, Pat?
I can, thank you.
That amazed me was this thing about the planes landing at the Grand Hotel. I mean, is there any evidence of where they actually landed then? Presumably around the back somewhere.
Down on Meathop Road must have been on the golf course. So plane landing, stop play, presumably. But no reports of it, just a few adverts saying that it was taking place that season, but not afterwards. Maybe maybe Roger knows a bit more. He did quite a bit of research on the hotel.
The hotel not only owned the golf course, they owned a farm adjacent to the golf course, which provided them with fruit and veg and whatever. And I think you're absolutely right. I think the plane landed on the fairway. So they must have called play to a halt and the plane came down. Because it wasn't just serving the Cumbria Grand, it was the golf hotel by that stage, I suppose.
Yeah.
It was also serving the Grange hotel because they were in the same holiday, same group.
They were. Yeah, I'd forgotten that. Yeah.
Pat, can I ask a question? The Crown Hotel eventually burnt down, and I've seen pictures of before and after. What had never occurred to me before is it actually has 12 chimneys. Is that perhaps why they brought the water tub in and heating the water to the other building? It's a lot of rooms for a building of that size.
Yeah, I really don't know. I've not seen a layout of it, but yes, a lot of chimneys. Every room had a fireplace, obviously. Yeah. There was demand. Anything else?
I think the question is, what killed the tourist industry in Grange?
Has it been killed?
Yes.
No, it hasn't. We still get visitors.
In the 1950s, just about every house or every building on the Esplanade was a guest house.
Yeah, well, then caravans came along.
What really happened was the car became affordable.
Yeah.
Previously, people had come to Grange on the train.
Yeah.
And the coach companies in Grange, because we had Parkers and Grange Motors and Ribble.
Yeah.
They were running tours to the Lake District from Grange. But then the car became available, and people, instead of staying at Grange so that you could get the coach, having arrived on the train, moved further into the Lake District. And those hotels or guest houses on the front, slowly but surely, petered away.
Yeah, but still we get lots of visitors. I mean, it gets busier every year. Yes, there was certainly a lull. There's always been lulls. In the 1820s, following the end of the wars, there were a lot of changes in the ownership of the crown. Sort of every year it changed hands for a few years. There were always problems that slowed the tourism down, but it comes back. And I remember back in the 1980s, the second homes around here, they couldn't let them out because people thought it was too far away from the Lake District. Now people are prepared to hire a second home, a holiday home in Grange, on the basis that it's cheaper than the Lake District. We seem to have become a lot happier travelling about. And yes, it's the cost of our own private transport that has enabled that. But yeah, it's a fascinating subject, and there's an awful lot more I could have said, but I've had to keep it very down to about 40 minutes. So. Any more questions?
Do we know when the road between Lindale and Grange was built?
Yes, just about sometime in the 1880s, because when the Hazelwood Hydro opened, there was a road there, and that opened in 87. So somewhere after the 1870s, I think. So yeah, they had to cut through quite a lot of rock, I believe, didn't they? Right, I think that's the end of questions. If Stuart unmutes himself, he can close the meeting.
In default of any other questions, on behalf of everybody present, many thanks, Pat. An amazingly interesting talk. I've only been in Grange since 1972, but I can remember the moving of the channel in the 1980s away from Grange, where people used to moor their yachts with quite large keels, and they would be in water all the time. But then the channel sped over to Arnside, and it's coming back again. It does move, and it perhaps moved more quickly in the years that you've talked about, because there would be less silting, I guess. But things do change. As Roger says, a lot of the guest houses on the Esplanade have gone. Even in the 1970s, most houses were guest houses. Then they were split into flats, a lot of them, or became single residences without having the facility of taking guests. So things do change, and perhaps tourism in Grange is more for people with cars to visit than to stay. There's not quite the same number of places to stay in Grange as perhaps there used to be. If, for instance, we've lost Graithwaite Manor in relatively recent times. So everything changes, but Grange is one of the few places which changes perhaps rather reluctantly, as you have outlined, Pat. And a lot of people want to keep it as it used to be. But we can't keep it exactly as it used to be. And it's fascinating to see how, since the 1700s, since things have changed so greatly. So thank you very much indeed for the research that you've done, the pictures that you've turned out, which I certainly hadn't seen most of them before, which were fascinating, and for so clearly giving us an impression of what has happened in the tourist industry here. Thank you very much indeed.